They tried to take down the home I designed for breaking visual harmony, but they didn't know I'm the one who wrote the very rules they're using to push me out. Like the video, subscribe to the channel because soon you'll see what happens. When someone fights back, not just with laws, but with the very blueprint the system twisted against them. The high-pitched buzz of a saw sliced through the calm of Granite Falls, like a knife through silence, cutting into a neighborhood already obsessed with order. Avery Tran stepped out of her home, steam still rising from the coffee cup in her hand, sandals not fully on, only to see three people in black suits standing on her lawn, aiming laser measures at her roof and grass like surveyors at a crime scene. A large HOA SUV was parked on the curb, its windshield stamped with a sticker inspection notice. Immediate compliance required. The woman leading the group, blonde ponytail, face unreadable, turned and looked Avery dead in the eye. "Good morning, Miss Tran. We're here to assess Level C landscaping violations. You'll receive a formal notice by the end of the week." Avery didn't smile. She set her coffee on the porch railing and crossed her arms. Violations for what? The woman didn't answer. She simply held up a printed board listing infractions. A red roof outside the granite color palette, a window exceeding standard height by 1-2 inches, and the front lawn, not an approved grass species per the 2021 covenant guidelines. Avery looked at the board, then back at her house and laughed. "First of all," she said, "my roof is natural clay, tile approved under the 2022 update. Second, that window is within the flexible design provision added in March last year. And third," she bent down, pulled a blade of grass. "This is foxtail, a native species listed in the Recommended Landscape Materials Guide of California." She paused, her voice flat but unmistakably clear. "I wrote that guide." The group froze. The woman blinked. "I'm sorry. You wrote what?" Avery pulled out her phone and opened a web page, California Residential Landscape Design Guidelines, 23 edition. At the top, compiled by Avery Tran, MLA PhD. "I don't just know the rules." Avery said, "I wrote them, and I don't recall a single line in the official version that says HOAs get to reinterpret standards to decide who fits in and who doesn't." The woman clenched her fist. "We're operating under the internal version approved by our board." Avery smiled cold and sharp. "I'd love to see that version, because if it differs from the version I filed with the state, then it's fake." One of the three agents signaled the others, and they started backing off. But before leaving, they dropped a sealed envelope on the porch. "Notice of emergency remediation, 14 days to comply. Failure to do so may result in asset seizure under Clause 6.3a. Avery picked up the envelope and walked back inside. She opened her laptop and accessed the official state code registry. Just as she suspected, Granite Falls HOA was using a gutted, altered version of her original work, modified with internal clauses that had never been approved. They weren't just making up rules, they were using her name to legitimize a framework designed to erase anyone who didn't match the preset mold. She began highlighting every altered clause in red. Eyes locked on the screen, she picked up her phone and dialed Ruby, the investigative reporter who once exposed the HOA that evicted a disabled veteran over unauthorized paint color. "I've got a story," Avery said. "This time it's not about an HOA breaking the rules. It's about them using my name." "To bend them?" Ruby asked. "What do you want?" Avery's voice turned cold. "I want them to learn a lesson. If you're going to use laws to control who gets to live, where you'd better not pick a fight with the person who wrote them." 2 days later, the entire Granite Falls neighborhood received an urgent internal bulletin. The homeowner at 1129 Ms. Avery Tran has committed severe violations of landscape design regulations. The board recommends enforcement action if no remediation occurs within 12 days. No name, no specifics, just a cold memo enough to plant suspicion. That same day, Avery's property file was posted publicly on the neighborhood board right at the front gate next to the welcome sign for new residents. Photos of her roof, her garden, her windows, each with red circles marking every deviation. A neighbor texted her. "Someone said you're messing up the landscape on purpose for attention." Avery didn't react. She just filed an official objection with the HOA. 3 days later, it was rejected. The reason: objection is invalid without submission of original approved design documents. The catch: her house was built under a custom layout, part of a diversity in design pilot that the HOA itself initiated, and quietly erased from internal archives 6 months after she moved in. Avery began digging old blueprints, email approvals, board meeting notes. Then she found the gap. Her original plan had the architect's signature, but no HOA stamp, which meant her home was never officially recorded as within guidelines, even though it had been greenlit. No definitive proof, no clear legal trail, but plenty of deliberate, soft gaps left in just the right places. That evening, Ruby showed up fresh, back from an investigative report on another forced removal in San Diego. She read through Avery's printed file, frowning. They're building a filter system, she said, but instead of saying, "We don't want this type of person here," they say, "We're just following the model." Avery nodded. Templates aren't the problem, but when a template becomes a weapon, it kills diversity, the same way pesticide kills butterflies. Ruby asked, "What are you going to do?" Avery set down her tea and pulled out a thick printout, the original state-approved landscape design, guidelines with her name on the cover, the official seal, and the addendum on native flexibility that the HOA had conveniently removed. "I'm sending it all to the Office of Planning Oversight, and if I have to, I'll sue them for using my name to legitimize something I never authorized." Ruby stayed quiet for a moment, then asked gently, "Are you sure this will be the kind of fight where the other side will do anything to protect their uniformity?" Avery looked up, eyes steady. "I don't need everyone's approval. I just need them to understand if they're going to use landscaping as a reason to erase people, then I'll show them what landscape really looks like when no one's afraid anymore." 3 days later, Avery posted a video on social media, not to accuse, but to educate. The title read, "Landscape is not a weapon." In the frame, she stood in front of her own house, its bright red roof glowing in the late afternoon sun, the yard filled with native plants growing freely among natural grass. She didn't complain. She wasn't angry. She simply walked viewers through each design choice. Why she chose that roof, that species of grass, and why her window stood 2 inches taller than the HOA standard. Because not everyone wants to live inside a box, she said. And design isn't meant to make every house look the same. It's meant to make everyone feel like they have the right to exist. The 8-minute video was shared over 100,000 times in 48 hours. Architects, activists, even art teachers began commenting, supporting sharing. A group of architecture students created a 3D model of Avery's home and dubbed it a symbol of freedom within structure. Granite Falls HOA responded with a cold mass email to all residents. "We urge you not to circulate misleading information that threatens urban order. All non-compliant designs must be uniformly addressed to prevent community imbalance." Simultaneously, they issued another notice escalating the matter to a repeat structural violation. Enforcement deadline 7 days. Avery wasn't surprised. She formally requested to see the internal guidelines the HOA claimed to be enforcing. They refused, citing confidentiality. Avery chuckled. "If a law applies to me but I'm not allowed to read it, that's not a law, that's a hidden blade." Ruby didn't wait around. She reached out to a former HOA board member, someone who'd resigned 2 years prior, citing disagreement with how the new developer leadership had tightened restrictions. The woman didn't hesitate. She sent Ruby a copy of the redacted internal code labeled clearly, "Not for external distribution, for board use only." Inside was a section titled "Soft Adjustments for Enhanced Aesthetic Direction," and below it a preferred visual template: gray roofs, Bermuda grass, trimmed flat symmetrical window panes, pastel exterior walls, no more than 5 plant species per yard. A handwritten note at the bottom read, "Avoid approving overly creative proposals, creates precedent." That's hard to manage. Ruby forwarded it to Avery with a text. They're not just rewriting the rule. They're screening residents by visual conformity. Avery printed it out and pinned it to the community bulletin board outside her house. Across the top, she wrote in bold marker, "If you were ever told that being different is wrong," here's where they wrote it down. That evening, as neighbors walked by, they stopped. One snapped a photo, another quietly peeled off the warning letter taped to Avery's door and gently took her hand. No words, no need for them. Because after being forced to conform for so long, they had forgotten what it felt like to see someone dare to be different. The next morning, as Avery stepped out of her house to head to work, she found her car blocked by a temporary sign that read, "Landscape infrastructure under inspection. Do not move vehicle without HOA approval." She walked over and saw a group of unfamiliar workers dressed in unbranded uniforms digging trenches right in front of her driveway. One of them told her, "We've been assigned to reinforce the irrigation system, part of a neighborhood infrastructure update." Avery asked, "Approved by who?" He didn't answer, just handed her a stack of photocopied papers. No names, no signatures, just a faint HOA Granite Falls stamp. That evening, Ruby traced the project back to a company named Crown Edge Developers, a real estate firm previously sued in 2 states for using HOA mandates to pressure residents out only to repurchase the homes at low prices and flip them with premium design upgrades. The most alarming detail, Crown Edge's CEO was the brother-in-law of the HOA's vice president, Avery, sat in her living room flipping through documents as the room grew colder, not in temperature, but in truth. What she'd suspected was now unfolding clearly. This wasn't about aesthetic conflict. This was a coordinated mechanism of property manipulation. They weren't creating landscape standards to protect the neighborhood. They were crafting visual rules to push out anyone who didn't fit the mold, clearing the path for block-wide redevelopment. From the outside, the HOA looked like it was maintaining standards, but in reality, they were weaponizing soft law, and profit was what they were protecting. Avery decided to go all in. She submitted everything, the full official guidelines, the redacted internal version, Crown Edge's records, and a list of past forced renovations to the California Board of Architectural and Landscape Oversight, along with a formal complaint demanding investigation. But that wasn't the final move. She organized a public live stream, broadcast statewide, in her own front yard beneath a banner that read, "Landscape should never be used to remove people." Over 2,000 people tuned in live. Avery didn't talk much about herself. Instead, she brought up 3 neighbors, a same-sex couple forced to change their front door because it was off-tone, a single mother ordered to tear out her vegetable garden to avoid odors, and an elderly Latino man threatened with legal action for hanging ceremonial lights that were too bright. Each spoke briefly, just a few sentences, but it was enough to show the community that if you didn't match the ideal template, you didn't belong here. At the end, Avery closed the live stream with one final line. "They thought I'd be afraid, but I didn't write the rules to follow them blindly. I wrote them so everyone could live together without needing permission to be themselves." As the live stream ended, a message came in from someone unexpected, a current member of the HOA board. It read simply, "I'm sorry." Attached was an audio file, the title "Internal Board Recording, Targeted Enforcement for Redevelopment Strategy." The audio file was 27 minutes long. The sound wasn't crystal clear, but clear enough to identify 3 voices, one belonging to the HOA's vice president, another to a representative from Crown Edge, and the third likely a financial consultant. The meeting took place in a quiet cafe where they discussed a plan to adjust residential density to match market alignment. One sentence cut through the static, unmistakably clear. "We can't have these artistic homes breaking up rows of uniform model properties. No one wants to buy into that." And then another voice followed. "Trans Place will be the test case. If we can push her out without backlash, the rest will be easy." Avery listened to the recording 3 times. Each time her grip on the table tightened, not just because of the cold calculation in their words, but because it confirmed what she had suspected. The home she built with knowledge and faith in human-centered design had been viewed from the start as a flaw to be eliminated. Ruby suggested releasing the audio immediately, but Avery shook her head. "No, this won't become a media spectacle. I'll take it where it belongs, court." She filed a formal lawsuit with the county court, not just to challenge the enforcement notice, but to demand a full investigation into asset manipulation, regulatory fraud, and breaches of community administrative ethics. Simultaneously, she submitted petitions to the American Institute of Architects, AIA, and the State Landscape Oversight Office, requesting a legal review of Granite Falls HOA's misuse of administrative documentation. And then she spoke up. Avery appeared on PBS in a live segment titled "The Right to Live, the Right to Design." When the host asked, "Are you afraid bringing all this to light?" she answered without hesitation, "I'm only afraid of one thing, that if I stay silent, 10 more people will be forced out, and no one will ever know just because they weren't pretty enough for the model." The interview triggered a surge in online searches for HOA misuse of authority, spiking over 300% overnight. Major news outlets began revisiting similar cases from New Jersey to Oregon, where HOAs had forced residents to tear down greenhouses, repaint roofs, cut down trees, or give up therapy animals, all in the name of preserving landscape spirit. Back in Granite Falls, a group of residents launched a petition to temporarily suspend the HOA board's unilateral enforcement powers. Over 70 signatures were gathered in the first 24 hours. On Tuesday morning, Avery stepped out to her balcony with a cup of coffee and saw a neighbor placing a pot of wild daisies on her lawn, the very kind once banned by the HOA. Beneath it, a handwritten note. True landscaping begins when someone dares to plant what they love. Avery smiled softly, just enough to feel that the spark had taken root. And this time it wasn't just her standing in the yard. It was the whole neighborhood, one person, one rooftop at a time, stepping out from the mold built to contain them. News of Avery's lawsuit spread faster than expected. Across architectural forums, she quietly became the unofficial face of a new movement. Freedom to build the right to personal design within shared community spaces. But once the cameras shut off, the real session began. The court accepted her case for preliminary review. At the same time, the State Planning Office issued an emergency directive ordering the Granite Falls HOA to suspend all landscape-related enforcement for 60 days. One chilling line stood out. Signs of overreach and manipulation of community codes have been identified. The HOA's response didn't come through words. It came through quiet retaliation. Residents who voiced support for Avery received emails accusing them of spreading false narratives against neighborhood management. One person was fined for leaving their trash bins out more than 12 hours past collection. Another was told to remove lanterns from their porch for disrupting pedestrian visual comfort. Everyone knew the HOA was lashing out, but at that same moment, cracks began to show. Sharon Lee, one of the 3 board members, resigned. No press, no grand announcement, just a line in an email to residents. I did not sign off on any of the current guidelines. I'm ashamed I stayed silent for so long. That night, Ruby got a call from a former Crown Edge employee. He didn't give his name, but told her for the past 5 years, the company had used landscape limitation tactics to pressure over 200 homeowners into forced renovations, mostly targeting those who couldn't fight back, the elderly immigrants, and those unfamiliar with legal recourse. The cost of mandatory compliance left them in debt. In debt they sold, and Crown Edge just happened to have a buyer. Ruby asked, "Do you have proof?" There was a long pause, then a text, "Tomorrow City Library, West Corner." "Come alone," Avery agreed, but she knew this was no longer a fight against overzealous neighbors obsessed with lawn symmetry. This was the gray zone between legality and morality, where rules bent to serve those in power. That night, a spontaneous community gathering unfolded on Avery's front lawn. Over 50 people showed up. No chairs, no microphone. Just one marker and a blank whiteboard. If you were ever told your home was wrong, write it here. The board filled up in 20 minutes. An old man wrote, "I was forced to prune my peach tree because the blossoms dropped too much." A young woman added, "They made me take down a painting. My mother did it, disrupted the visual cohesion." And one final message written in bold red at the bottom, "We let them control how we felt about beauty. Now we don't even know what we like anymore." Avery stood and watched. She didn't speak. She didn't lead. Because in that moment, difference had become strength, and the one thing the HOA no longer controlled was the free thought of the people. That afternoon, the city library felt empty, almost like it had been made that way on purpose. Avery sat at a tucked-away table in the west corner where dim light filtered through dust-smeared glass. 15 minutes passed, no one came. 18 minutes. She started to wonder if it was a setup, but then a man walked in, wrinkled shirt, thin-rimmed glasses, carrying an old canvas bag. He didn't give his name, just sat down and spoke fast, low. Never looking up, I used to work in internal data analysis for Crown Edge. My job was to identify potential enforcement targets from HOA records. Avery didn't breathe. He went on. They don't choose homes randomly. They use an algorithm based on fee history, community engagement, exterior color schemes, delayed responses, even estimated financial profiles pulled from leaked third-party data. He placed a small USB drive on the table. This contains the classification map of homes flagged as priority conversions. You're near the top. Avery's voice cracked as she asked, "They knew I wrote the landscape code. And still, he cut her off because you wrote it. You symbolize disruption. And their business model depends on perfect visual alignment. You didn't fit." Before leaving, he said just one thing. "This isn't an HOA anymore. It's a disguise filter, and if you don't bring it into the light, it'll quietly filter out thousands more." That night, Ruby and Avery opened the data. In the list of nearly 500 homes marked for conversion were every kind of other widows, LGBT+ couples, artists, immigrants, elderly, singles, each flagged as low community cohesion. This wasn't coincidence, it was social sorting disguised as neighborhood management. Avery sat in silence. She knew she couldn't stay quiet anymore. The next day, she submitted the entire data set to the California State Commission on Housing and Civic Oversight, along with a formal request to open a statewide investigation into HOA developer hybrid enforcement practices. On social media, Ruby launched a campaign under the hashtag #DesignedOut, the people designed to be excluded. It spread in under 48 hours. Hundreds shared their stories being forced to remove roofs, repaint walls, take down art, give up pets, even leave their homes because they disrupted the landscape. A group of civil rights attorneys announced free legal support for anyone unfairly targeted by HOA action, and in the middle of the storm, Avery found a letter on her doorstep. No name, no envelope, just a single line. "You think this is about landscaping, it's about control. And you're making us lose money. A lot of money." She read the words, folded the page, and pinned it on the community board right next to a photo of her house's red roof. Beneath it, she added only one sentence. "If beauty exists to serve power, it's no longer beauty, it's assimilation." 1 week after the hashtag #DesignedOut campaign went national, the California State Commission on Housing and Civic Oversight officially announced a multi-agency investigation into all HOAs linked to real estate developers, starting with Granite Falls. A temporary freeze was issued on all pending enforcement contracts, and in the preliminary case file, one name stood out: Avery Tran, plaintiff, key witness, and certified state design authority. The media swarmed. News outlets, podcasts, architecture, magazines, civil rights blogs, and all asking, who really controls these polished, uniform neighborhoods? How many people have been quietly pushed out for not matching a model no one voted on? And why is the person who wrote the law being punished by its counterfeit? Avery didn't go on television. She didn't give long speeches. She appeared only once in a phone shot clip recorded by Ruby, unedited raw, standing in front of her house, holding the original version of the design standard that the HOA had falsified. She said just 3 lines. "I wrote this standard to expand choice, not to build fences. If anyone uses it to exclude others, they're the ones in violation." Meanwhile, in Granite Falls, pressure crushed the HOA board. 3 members resigned. 1 was placed under investigation for financial misconduct. Crown Edge suspended all remodeling projects and released a vague statement citing a misunderstanding between commercial aims and community spirit. But residents weren't buying it. They held an internal vote demanding to sever all HOA ties with any company holding financial stakes in construction contracts. The result, 84% in favor. Avery no longer had to fight alone. Messages poured in from other neighborhoods, people pushing to revise bylaws, reclaim the right to design their yards, paint their homes, express their identities. In San Jose, a mother won her case after being told to dismantle a homemade playset for her child. In Pasadena, a Chinese-American homeowner was allowed to reinstall the roof tiles once deemed non-conforming. And in Sacramento, a proposed bill called the Community Design Freedom Act. The Avery Act began early drafting. But Avery's final move came from the courtroom, not the podium. She filed a new lawsuit, not just to cancel her own enforcement order, but to officially recognize systemic misconduct, the deliberate creation of aesthetic-based resident filtering rooted in biased design standards and social exclusion. This was no longer a personal case. It was a class action blueprint, a legal foundation for anyone nationwide who had been crushed under HOA overreach. When asked why she didn't stop after already winning, Avery replied simply, "I'm not rebuilding my house. I'm repairing a system, so the ones who never dared speak won't have to bow their heads again." On the first day of the trial, Avery arrived early, not to review documents her legal team had prepared every argument meticulously over the past 2 weeks, but simply to stand outside the courthouse and observe. She said nothing. She just watched the line of people forming at the gate. Some held banners that read, "Regulations don't outrank dignity." Others wore shirts with #DesignedOut. A group of architecture students wore pins that said, "I design so people can live, not be excluded." No one organized them. They came on their own. Inside the courtroom, the HOA's attorney, hired last minute from a powerful law firm, opened with a classic diversion tactic, reframing the issue. "This is not about the right to self-design," he said. "This is about preserving the stability of a community. And stability doesn't come from chaos. He projected images of Avery's home, placing them side by side with model-compliant ones, then asked, "Is this not the work of someone actively disrupting the communal spirit for personal expression?" Avery did not respond immediately. When it was her turn to speak, she walked calmly to the podium, opened her folder, and pulled out two documents. One was the original design standard she had authored. The other was the altered, selectively edited version the HOA had illegally enforced. She didn't read them line by line. She simply held both up and asked, "If you lived in a neighborhood and someone used rules that weren't in the law to tell you you were wrong, would you accept that?" Then she looked directly at the bench and added, "If a woman, an architect, someone who helped write the design standards for this state, can still be threatened, discredited, and pushed to the edge of losing her home, then who do you think is next?" The courtroom fell silent. Not because her words were fiery, but because they were unshakably clear. No anger, no dramatics, just truth placed precisely where it needed to be. But outside, the backlash had already begun. Far-right media outlets ran headlines like, "Radical architect threatens HOA," "Autonomy, woman wants to turn suburbia into aesthetic laboratory," and "Avery Tran changed jobs 4 times in 6 years, can she speak about stability?" Edited clips where she spoke about breaking uniformity were uploaded to TikTok, overlaid with ominous music. An anonymous email was sent to her university, implying she had incited students against local governance. That night, Avery received a package. Inside was a small plastic house model, painted entirely black. A note was taped beneath it. "Homes that don't match the landscape will be shadowed like this." Ruby saw the box and exhaled sharply. They are using fear to claw back what they have lost control. Avery gave a faint smile, and they're afraid because for the first time, people don't believe in that control anymore. The next morning, Avery Tran's name trended on Twitter, not because she had won in court, but because a heavily edited video clip had gone viral. In the clip, she appeared to say, "If needed, I'll tear down stability itself." The actual sentence was, "If stability means eliminating all difference, then I'm ready to challenge it." But once cut, it became a weapon. Right-wing news channels ran with the headline, "Radical architect threatens the community." A talk show invited a self-described sociologist to discuss the dangers of individualism in modern neighborhoods, painting Avery as a rogue figure out to dismantle a well-functioning system. Meanwhile, the HOA released an internal bulletin to every Granite Falls resident, accusing Avery of sowing division, weakening neighborhood unity, and lowering property values. The bulletin closed with one line: "One person may design a landscape, but only many can keep it in order." Avery said nothing, posted nothing, but 48 hours later she held a press conference. Not flashy, no press wall, no stage lighting, just a live stream on a plain white background. She began by playing the full unedited video clip. Then came photos. 10 homes that had been forced to remove gardens, change doors, strip their roofs, and then silence. 15 seconds. No speech, no anger. Finally, she spoke one sentence. "I'm not tearing down stability, I'm redefining it." She held up a folder. Inside were testimonies, witnesses willing to testify in court, a grandmother forced to change her gate because it was too curved, a black homeowner whose request to hang a memorial painting had been denied. "If I'm the problem," Avery said, "then so are they. And if we're the problem, then maybe the thing calling itself order is the real problem." At the same time, Ruby published an investigation. Over the past 5 years, more than 1,700 HOA enforcement cases across California followed the same pattern: fabricated bylaws, selectively applied soft codes used to restructure entire resident populations. Several real estate firms had created HOAs of their own, embedding unvoted rules, then enforcing them through self-defined standards. This was no longer about Avery. That evening, a small truck pulled up outside the front step, the support center Avery and her friends had built for displaced residents. The driver left behind a box of paint and an old wooden sign. "Community Design Hub Prototype," built by students. No one gave instructions, no one waited for permission. People just began fixing the center, painting the doors, replacing windows, planting again. The same people once told to tear down flowers were now planting them back. The ones ordered to take down artwork were hanging it again. A boy, maybe 10 years old, taped a scribbled note to the community board. It read, "The best house is the one where no one gets kicked out for being different." Avery read it and nodded slowly. She understood no courtroom could ever declare justice. Justice begins only when a community refuses to stay silent. The next court session was no longer about non-compliant landscaping or improper architectural standards. The presiding judge officially reclassified the case as a systemic investigation abuse of architectural regulations with discriminatory intent. For the first time in California, a private citizen was suing an HOA not merely for wrongful enforcement, but for turning design codes into tools of selective exclusion. Avery's lawyer didn't lean on personal expression or the aesthetics of self-design. She opened with a single chart from over 200 enforcement actions in the past 3 years. 91% targeted so-called non-uniform residents, including Asian homeowners, single individuals, religious minorities, low-income families, and households with non-traditional structures. One simple graph said more than 1,000 pages of argument ever could. Then came the witnesses, not experts, not lawyers, but ordinary residents. An elderly man was forced to remove a stone statue of his late wife because it disrupted visual solemnity. A single mother testified how she was made to repaint her front door because the color was too bright and emotionally distracting. A Filipino-American teacher had to tear down her porch roof because its ethnic pattern was deemed culturally incongruent. And finally, Avery took the stand. No documents, no theatrics, just words. I'm not here to reclaim a house. I'm here to keep a promise to my students that design is not just about aesthetics, it's about ethics. And if landscaping is being used to push people out of communities, then I will stand at that threshold and say, no, this person still has the right to be here. In the courtroom, the HOA representatives had little to say. They offered no answers when asked who approved the list of homes requiring alignment, who decided what was misaligned with community vision, and why was there no resident vote on the version of the standards being enforced? In response, the HOA's attorney simply stated, "We followed procedures set before us. No single individual is responsible." And with that, the room fell quiet because everyone understood when no one takes responsibility, the entire system becomes the problem. The court adjourned without a verdict, but as Avery left the courthouse, a group of residents was waiting. No signs, no slogans, just a stack of papers, a petition to revoke all current landscaping codes. We want to rebuild from scratch with real resident participation. Avery took it in silence. She didn't need to speak. She knew this wasn't a lawsuit anymore. It was a reclaiming of the right to exist against a system that had long hidden power beneath layers of perfect paint. 3 weeks after the final hearing, the district court issued its preliminary ruling. A simple headline appeared on the official website. The court finds that the application of redacted architectural guidelines by the Granite Falls HOA shows signs of administrative misconduct and discriminatory intent. At the same time, an emergency order froze all enforcement actions based on the HOA's internal standards. An independent review board was appointed to audit every bylaw design approval process and the so-called low-response resident list used to categorize homeowners. Avery didn't celebrate. She quietly removed the landscape violation notice from her front yard, a paper that had hung there for 78 days. She didn't tear it up. She folded it neatly and pressed it between 2 pages of the official design manual, where it would stay as a future case study for her students. The media swarmed, but this time she declined every interview. Instead, she posted a brief note on her personal blog. "I didn't build my home to express personality. I built it to live in alignment with who I am." If a system requires us to pretend sameness in order to stay, then that's not housing. It's a form of coerced silence. The post was reprinted in design magazines, quoted at architecture conferences, and cited by high school students writing essays about personal truth in organized society. In Granite Falls, the atmosphere shifted. Residents began repainting their homes in colors they actually liked. Art appeared on porches, lights went up without permission, slips. No one said, "We need to match anymore." Instead, they said, "As long as we respect each other, it worked." 1 month later, Avery received a small parcel from the same anonymous sender who had once mailed her a black-painted model house as a threat. This time it contained a new model, her house red roof, natural landscaping, tall windows. A tiny paper banner stood on the lawn in front of it. "Homes don't need to match to be called a community." Avery read the note, then sat at her drafting table. She began sketching Granite Falls, not to redesign it, but to archive it. To record the moment when this place finally quietly earned the right to be called a neighborhood, not a zone of regulated residency, yet it did. The following month, Avery received invitations from 4 places: a National Architecture Symposium in Seattle, a panel on design and justice at UC Berkeley, a nomination for an honorary award from the American Institute of Architects, and a simple email from a small high school in Fresno. "Would you come talk to our class about how a roof can change a whole law?" She declined the first 3, but she said yes to the high school. There she stood in front of 30 students wearing hoodies and slouched in plastic chairs. She didn't talk about laws or courtrooms or regulations. She just told a story about being forced to change the very home she designed because someone else thought it looked different, and how different is sometimes treated like a flaw. When one student asked, "Did you ever want to give up?" Avery smiled and said yes, but then I remembered, if I stay quiet, they'll think I agree. And what I don't agree with is being called the problem. Just because I don't look like everyone else, the class clapped. Not for victory, but because they understood design isn't about making things pretty. It's about making things fair. Back in Granite Falls, the front step, the community center, Avery had helped create now had a new hand-painted sign by local residents. Beside its name were 3 colored squares, red forest green and deep gold, the very shades once marked discouraged for aesthetic harmony by the old HOA. Now they were the center's palette. Inside, a quiet gathering was underway. No microphones, no dress codes, no stage. An elderly woman read a book on the lawn. A boy sketched his front gate in colored pencil. A queer couple taught others how to replant gardens they were once told to destroy. Avery walked in and sat down without a word. Someone quietly brought her a cup of chamomile tea, the same flower once flagged by the HOA as incompatible with the visual climate. She smiled. Not because everything was fixed, but because she knew in the end she didn't need to win to reclaim her home. She just needed to hold the door open so no one else would be pushed out ever again. On a spring morning, as morning glories climbed and curled around the wooden gate behind her house, Avery received an email from the state of Oregon. It came from a small group of residents in a neighborhood called Forest Bend, where the local HOA had just passed a new rule standardizing porch awnings and begun sending warning letters to over 30 homes, most of them newcomers. In the message they wrote, "We're not famous, we don't have the media, we don't have our own lawyer, but we have the house we built with our own hands and hope, and we don't want to lose it just because someone thinks our roof color disrupts aesthetic harmony." They attached a photo of a small sky blue house with white trim and sunflowers planted on either side of the door, then asked, "Can you help us, or at least show us where to begin?" Avery didn't reply right away. She sat at her screen looking at the unfamiliar house in the photo and wondered, how many more people will need a full-blown fight just to live a simple, honest life? She forwarded the email to Ruby and typed a short note. Start with the architectural standard. Next, build a list of who's being affected. And most important, ask the residents if they were ever given a vote. A few days later, Forest Bend held its first public residents meeting with an open ballot. No projector, no lawyers, just folding chairs, a whiteboard, and one person who stood up and said, "We've let others tell us what living right looks like for too long. From now on, we'll define for ourselves what beautiful means." Avery's story was told there not as legend, but as precedent. Not the woman who won a lawsuit, but the first who didn't bow to rules she never helped write. Back in Granite Falls, summer arrived alongside a new community board hung in front of the front step. No violation notices, no lists of non-compliant homes, just handwritten notes from neighbors. "Thank you for helping me keep the apple tree by my porch. Because of you, my daughter got to hang up the painting her mother made. Because of you, I stopped seeing my home as a problem." One evening, Avery sat on her front steps. An older woman passed by, paused and asked, "Aren't you tired doing something this big just to save one small roof?" Avery smiled. "No," she said, "because it's not just my roof anymore." She pointed out across the neighborhood where red, gray, yellow, and green rooftops mingled like brushstrokes in a painting of acceptance. Now it's a space where people get to be themselves without asking permission. One morning, Avery was trimming the lavender bushes by her gate when she heard a car pull up in front of the house. A tall, thin man with silver hair stepped out carrying a rolled-up canvas under his arm. He didn't say his name. He only asked one question. "Is there a place here where you can hang up something that was once forced to come down?" Avery nodded and led him into the shared room at the front step. On the walls, paintings and photos in mismatched frames hung in no particular order. Whoever wanted to hang something did. The man unrolled his canvas. It was a charcoal portrait of a smiling woman, hair tousled, holding a ceramic mug. "My wife," he said, "this used to hang on our porch." The HOA said it was too personal for a communal-facing space. "I took it down, put it in a cabinet. It's been there nearly 5 years." Avery handed him a nail without asking anything more. He hammered it in himself, hung the portrait, and stood back to look at it. For a long time, then he turned to her. "I should have done this a long time ago. I just didn't know I was allowed." She said nothing, just rested her hand gently on his shoulder, like a quiet way of saying, "Now you are." News of the front step had spread further than Avery expected. A trade school in another state used the center as a case study in human-centered design versus policy-centered design. Architecture firm invited Avery to advise on post-HOA community redevelopment. An international magazine called it the soft architectural pushback against administrative authority. But Avery never appeared on magazine covers. She still lived in the same old house with its red roof, wild garden, and tall windows now considered a local cultural landmark. She posted no photos of victory, gave no grand speeches. Every afternoon, she just sat on her porch watching the neighborhood kids ride their bikes in loops, their hands busy repainting the old center walls with the words, "Here no one has to be the same." On a rainy day, a young woman came to see her, a senior in a landscape architecture program. She asked, "You once wrote that landscape is ethics, but if people are still using landscape to exclude others, does design still mean anything?" Avery answered softly, "Design isn't about control. It's a reminder that people are not rows of matching columns, and if anyone uses it to push others out, then the designer should be the first to step up and defend the ones left out." The student wrote the words down exactly as spoken, because in that moment she understood design isn't just a profession, it's a promise to someone who never got to choose but still wants the chance to live their own way. That autumn, Granite Falls held its first community festival without HOA oversight. No mandatory color palettes, no unified themes. Each household picked its own booth. Some sold homemade pastries, others ran henna stations, and a group of students set up a tiny stage to perform original indie music, something once banned for disrupting daytime aesthetic harmony. Avery didn't take the stage. She sat at the plant booth handing out morning glory seeds, the same plant once labeled aggressively invasive. Everyone who received seeds signed a large wooden board and wrote a note beneath their name. "I choose the right to live differently, but not be pushed out because of it." That board was later mounted at the entrance of the front step as a public promise here. Everyone belongs, no permission needed to be yourself as the sun dipped. People lit lanterns around the shared garden. No one announced it, just small lights enough to see each other's faces clearly in the dark. A child asked Miss Avery, "Who does this neighborhood belong to now?" She smiled gently, tousling his hair. "To those who once thought they didn't belong here, but stayed anyway." She looked around, rooftops in every color, fences scribbled with paint, flags pointing in different directions, music out of tune, chaotic yet alive. And she understood. Some victories aren't ruled by courts, don't make headlines, and don't get etched into monuments. They simply live in the fact that people no longer have to bow their heads just to exist in the place they call home. Avery returned, closed the door softly. On the porch, her lavender still bloomed, leaning toward the sun that was almost gone. And as she did every evening, she wrote one last line in her notebook. "No one needs to grant you permission. You just need to stop staying silent." Mom, thank you for following Avery's journey. Someone who didn't just keep her house, but defended the right to live differently. If you believe design isn't meant to exclude, but to protect who we really are, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next story. Share this video with anyone who's ever felt pressured to make sense just to be accepted, because we don't need permission to be ourselves.